Hello, fellow night owls. Tonight, we journey into the beautiful yet harsh time period that was feudal Japan. Relax your mind and body as we explore the intricate world of warlords, samurai, and cherry blossoms, and uncover what made this time period a bountiful well of radiant culture and innovation, but also oppressive feudal systems and constant warfare that made life challenging for the many ordinary citizens just trying to get by. But before we begin, please take a moment to let us know in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is, as it's always fascinating to see how far these stories reach. Well, get comfortable. Let your eyes slowly get heavier and heavier as we take a trip to feudal Japan through historical accounts and intimate stories. Let us begin. The merchant struggle. The story of the Yamamoto family illustrates the precarious position of many merchants in feudal Japan. Though their class was slowly gaining economic influence, they still found themselves near the bottom of the social hierarchy, subject to heavy taxes and restrictions. For the Yamamotos, running a small silk trading shop in Edo, life was a constant struggle to stay afloat. Long days were spent hunched over bolts of fine silk, carefully measuring and preparing the elegant fabrics. The whole family worked together, with even the youngest children helping to sort materials and organize inventory. Though their wares were worn by noble ladies, the Yamamotos themselves subsisted on simple meals of rice and pickled vegetables. Every spare coin was reinvested in the business. But rising silk prices and the heavy taxes levied by the shogun ate away at their modest profits. The Yamamotos lived in constant concern about falling behind on payments and having their shop seized. Additional payments to local officials became just another cost of doing business. To make matters more complex, the family harbored a dangerous secret. They were practicing Christians in a time when the foreign faith was strictly forbidden. If discovered, they risked severe punishment as enemies of the state. But their beliefs were a comfort in their hard lives, and they cherished their hidden prayer books and whispered devotions. It's hard to fathom the level of restriction feudal Japanese society imposed on those of the lower classes. Not only did poverty and demanding work define their existence, but a rigid code of conduct controlled virtually every aspect of their behavior and appearance. Strict sumptuary laws laid out in minute detail what each social rank could wear, eat, and own. Peasants and merchants were explicitly banned from wearing silk, bright colors, or ornate hairstyles. The size and materials of their homes and furnishings were likewise prescribed. These detailed regulations ensured that the elite could never be confused for commoners. The way of strict order, but the conformity and control pressed further than outward appearances. Frivolous entertainments like theater, music, and dancing were frowned upon as improper and unseemly. Public displays of affection were considered shameful. Proper etiquette had to be observed at all times, with numerous rituals for everything from serving tea to greeting superiors. A culture of restraint and discipline pervaded society, especially among the samurai. Overt shows of emotion were deeply inappropriate for the warrior class, who were expected to face all of life's trials with stoic endurance. One slip in decorum could mean a loss of face and reputation. For women, the restrictions were even more suffocating. Quiet obedience and selfless service were the highest virtues of a proper lady. An idealized beauty was one of a pale, slender figure wrapped in voluminous kimono, with every hair and fold perfectly in place. This was the confined world of Yukiko, a young geisha in training. To the men she entertained, she was the picture of feminine grace and artful elegance. She could pour sake and deliver witty conversation with a carefully cultivated air of mysterious charm. But inside, Yukiko chafed at the austere code of conduct that governed her every move. As a geisha, her appearance was strictly regulated, from the tilt of her elaborate hairstyle to the shade of red on her lips. She once dared to wear a purple kimono reserved for higher-ranking geisha and was severely punished. confined to her quarters for days. Another time, Yukiko allowed herself to return the flirtatious affections of a charming young client. But when the tea house mistress caught wind of it, she was harshly disciplined as a reminder that geisha were never to be mistaken for common courtesans. Yukiko's allure was in her untouchable beauty, not her availability. As the years passed, Yukiko grew increasingly disillusioned with the false realm of the flower and willow world. She was essentially bound by contract, her talents owned by the establishment that had invested in her training. There was no room for real love or free choices. She began to long for independence as an ordinary wife and mother, but knew the chances were slim. Instead, she numbed her hidden sorrows with stolen sips of sake when no one was looking, for even displaying such habits would be a disgraceful break in character. The harsh justice system, of course. For commoners who ran afoul of the law, the consequences were infinitely harsher than a few stern remarks. The feudal justice system was concerned more with keeping order and control than any pretense of impartial process. Laws were strict, guilt was assumed, and punishments were severe and swift. Minor offenses routinely drew harsh corporal punishment. Pickpockets and vandals could expect public beatings, their skin marked until they lost consciousness from the pain. Thieves and those who committed adultery often had noses or ears removed as a permanent mark of shame. Serious crimes met with horrific punishment. The techniques were various and prolonged: boiling, burning, beating with heavy rods. Crucifixion involved tying the condemned to a cross and piercing them repeatedly with razor-sharp bamboo shoots. Perhaps most infamous was death by fire, a method reserved for arsonists and those guilty of serious violence. The convict would be tied spread eagle as hot coals were piled on their body, slowly burning them over several agonizing days. Their charred limbs might be removed one by one until merciful death arrived. Pity, the hungry young peasant who dared to steal fish from the market. After the briefest of trials, he received 30 lashes with a wooden paddle, the vicious beating leaving him delirious and half dead. But as a repeat offender, his fate was likely sealed. Petty theft carried a sentence of beheading under the Tokugawa regime. Indeed, the threat of gruesome punishment loomed over all those without rank or connections. The life of the common people, the threat of the law, was just one more burden bearing down on the backs of the people. Their lives were defined by endless toil and deprivation, with only the slimmest hope of rising above their assigned station. For the peasants, who made up the vast majority, poverty ground them down to the literal dirt. Punishing taxes and rice levies left little to fill their bellies. They subsisted on millet and radish tops, watching their lords feast on white rice and meat. Crushing debts piled up season after back-breaking season. Many became essentially bound to their land and landlord. If their rice harvest fell short, their children might be sold into servitude to pay the difference. A bad crop could spell disaster for a whole village. When famine struck, peasants ate grass and bark to survive. Bands of gaunt, desperate wanderers roamed the roads. Abandoned children cried in empty huts. Bodies piled in ditches. Relief was minimal and selective. The poor perished in droves when disease burned through. Smallpox and dysentery churning on top of malnutrition. They could only pray to Jizo and Kannon, the merciful bodhisattvas, for salvation from suffering in the next life. Opportunities for a better lot were vanishingly rare. The rigid class boundaries were nearly impossible to cross without being born into privilege. Education was limited to basic reading and calligraphy learned at a temple school, if that. For most, the only path was the backbreaking one their fathers and grandfathers walked. Tales of desperation. Is it any wonder then that some peasants reached a breaking point? That after a string of poor harvests, a village might rise up in raw desperation, even knowing the futility? Such was the case in 1781 when starving farmers in the northern regions attacked tax collectors and stormed their lords' castle demanding relief from rice levies. Hundreds more flocked to join them, seizing weapons and torching government storehouses. But like every peasant rebellion, this one was doomed. The uprising dissolved in the face of trained samurai. The farmers fled to the mountains. The Lord ordered all the village men beheaded as an example, their wives and daughters sold into servitude. And so the peasants submitted again, backs bent under the knowledge that they could rage against their fate but never escape it. They prayed for the distant promise of the world turned upside down when the virtuous poor would become lords in the Buddha's paradise. The feudal order groaned on for another century, but the weight of its oppression grew heavier. The merchants and artisans grew restless, their coin buying them fine things, but not respect. The samurai found their way of life threatened, their rituals of honor ringing hollow. Cracks spread through the foundation. The fury and desperation of millions upon whose stooped backs the elite few perched in splendor. The story of Masato, the artisan. Consider the tale of Masato, a young artisan's apprentice in the city of Osaka. His master was a skilled but ill-tempered swordsmith, prone to heavy drinking and fits of rage. One evening, when his master was berating him harshly over a minor mistake, Masato lost his temper and struck him with a tool, fracturing his skull. Masato was swiftly arrested and thrown in a dank prison cell to await trial. He was denied adequate food and water, kept in darkness, and questioned relentlessly by his captors. Exhausted and disoriented, he eventually confessed to the attack under the threat of severe punishment. At his trial, Masato's guilt was presumed from the start. His tearful pleas that it was an accident and his appeals to his master's good character fell on deaf ears. With the swordsmith hovering near death, the judge wasted little time in reaching a verdict. Masato would face crucifixion for his crime. On the day of his punishment, Masato was pale and shaking as he was paraded through the streets and bound to the cross. As the executioners prepared to pierce him with spears, Masato's elderly father came forward and prostrated himself before the magistrate. With his face pressed to the ground, he begged to take his only son's place on the cross, insisting that his own life was near its end, while Masato's was just beginning. With great sorrow, the magistrate agreed to the substitution, acknowledging the father's noble sacrifice. Masato wailed as he watched his father, the man who had always protected him, be put to a painful death in his stead. The guilt was more painful than the spears would have been. He would go on to live a long life as a master swordsmith himself, but he was forever haunted by the cost of that second chance. Stories like Masato's were all too common in feudal Japan, where a single misstep could doom an entire family. The cruel and unyielding justice system was just one more way the powerful exerted control over the masses. The rice farmers considered the Ishida family, humble rice farmers in a small village near Kyoto. For generations, they had tended this same small plot of land, barely making a living. They lived simply in a tiny thatched hut, subsisting on a diet of mostly rice and vegetables with the occasional fish or scrap of meat. The father, Ryuta, was a stoop-shouldered man who had known nothing but toil since he could walk. Each day he rose before dawn to tend the rice paddies, planting, weeding, and watering until his hands were rough and muddy. His wife, Chaya, worked alongside him while also caring for their 3 small children and aging parents. Despite their best efforts, the Ishida family lived in a state of constant uncertainty. More than half their rice harvest went to paying rents and taxes to their local lord. What remained was barely enough to fill their bellies and trade for other necessities. They were one flood or drought away from disaster. That misfortune came in the summer of 1783, when a powerful typhoon tore through their region, flattening fields and destroying storehouses. Ryuta's entire rice crop was wiped out along with their seed stock for the next planting. they suddenly faced the very real prospect of starvation. With heavy hearts, Ruta and Chiyo made the difficult decision to sell their young daughter, Emiko, into indentured servitude with a wealthy merchant family. It was the only way to keep the rest of the family fed. They told themselves it was temporary, that they would work hard and save every spare coin to one day buy back her freedom. But deep down they knew it might be the last they ever saw of their bright-eyed girl. Emiko's story was tragically common in feudal Japan, where the crushing poverty ensnared families for generations. Children were often seen as assets to be sold or traded in times of hardship. Many rural girls ended up in city establishments, forever losing their innocence to keep their families afloat a little longer. The philosophical foundation in the 15th century, a philosophy began to take hold among the ruling elite that would further codify the rigid social hierarchy. Neo-Confucianism, as it was known, preached that social harmony depended on everyone knowing their proper place and dutifully fulfilling their role no matter how lowly. At the top of this divine order was the emperor who reigned but did not rule. He was seen as a godlike figure, a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, but held little practical power that was wielded by the shogun, the supreme military leader who ruled in the emperor's name. Below the shogun were the daimyo, the feudal lords who controlled vast estates and armies of samurai. Though subordinate to the shogun, the daimyo enjoyed wide autonomy in their domains, essentially functioning as kings. They were expected to keep the peace, collect taxes, and provide military service when called upon. At the bottom were the peasants, artisans and merchants, the vast majority of the population. Neo-Confucian thought held that they were inherently inferior to the samurai class above them, and that their only path to virtue was through obedience and service. Nowhere were these oppressive ideas more enthusiastically embraced than in Edo, the seat of the shogun, life in Edo. There, conformity was the highest ideal, and any deviation from societal norms was seen as a threat to the natural order. The Tokugawa shoguns, who ruled Japan for over 250 years, were enthusiastic proponents of Neo-Confucianism. They used it to justify their authoritarian rule and the strict sumptuary laws that dictated every aspect of daily life. Commoners were told what they could wear, what they could eat, even what kind of houses they could live in based on their station. Peasants were forbidden from wearing silk and had to make their clothes from rough hemp or cotton. Merchants, though increasingly wealthy from trade, were banned from flaunting their success. Even the well-bred geisha were bound by countless rules governing their appearance and behavior. The political scheming and intrigue common in Kyoto and Osaka were muted in Edo, where an absolute adherence to decorum reigned. Samurai walked through the streets, secure in their privileged status, while commoners bowed respectfully. Public criticism of the government was forbidden, and informers eagerly reported the slightest hints of rebellion. The scholar's daughter in this stifling atmosphere where etiquette and ritual came before all else is where we find Midori, a young woman born into the merchant class. Her family ran a small but prosperous shop selling the fine paper used for calligraphy and official documents, giving them a tenuous link to elite society. From a young age, Midori chafed at the limitations placed on her as a woman and a commoner. She was quick-witted and harbored secret ambitions of becoming a scholar, devouring classical texts in her father's storeroom. But such intellectual pursuits were deemed unseemly for a merchant's daughter, who was expected to master the tea ceremony and flower arranging to attract a suitable husband. Midori's parents were loving but firm, impressing upon her the importance of upholding the family's honor and knowing her place. They had sacrificed much to provide her with a gentle upbringing and could not tolerate any rebelliousness that might threaten their hard-earned respectability. So Midori learned to hide her true nature behind a mask of quiet obedience. She poured tea and recited poetry with a serene smile, all the while dreaming of a different life. She snuck her precious books under her futon and read them by candlelight, thrilling to the forbidden knowledge. Her nightly studies came to an abrupt end when her mother found her stash of controversial texts. They were works by a renegade philosopher who dared to question the prevailing doctrine of blind subservience to authority. Midori's mother was horrified, fearing what would happen if such dangerous ideas were discovered in their home. Midori pleaded that the books were not hers, that she was simply minding them for a friend. But her mother saw through the lies. As punishment, Midori was confined to her room for a month, permitted to leave only to assist in the shop under close supervision. Her books were burned in the courtyard, the ashes scattered to the wind. From that day forward, Midori was chastened into meek compliance. Resigned to the restricted path laid before her, she married the son of a fellow merchant, a kind but dull man who shared none of her intellectual curiosity. She bore 3 children and devoted herself to being a model wife and mother, burying her unorthodox dreams deep within to the outside world. Midori was the picture of a proper Edo woman, graceful and ever obliging. Only in the deepest reaches of the night, lying beside her slumbering husband, did she allow her mind to wander to what might have been. If only she had been born into a different time, a different place, a different body. The hidden Christian's asterisk. But in remote corners of the archipelago, far from the watchful gaze of the authorities, pockets of resistance smoldered. On the wave-battered islands of the far south, a strange foreign faith was taking root, promising a spiritual liberation from the rigid structures of feudal life. Catholic missionaries, first welcomed by the shogunate as purveyors of new knowledge and trade, had been violently expelled in the early 1600s. Christianity was banned as a subversive influence, its adherents forced to renounce their beliefs or face severe punishment. Many went underground, forming secret communities bound by faith and necessity. Among them were the hidden Christians of the Shimabara Peninsula, a rugged land of craggy inlets and lush green valleys. For over 2 centuries, they outwardly practiced Buddhism while secretly passing down the rites and rituals of the church. Baptisms were performed in secluded forest glens, masses held in secret after midnight. The villagers of Shimabara made a meager living as farmers and fishermen, scratching survival from the stingy soil. They found solace in their clandestine faith, which preached the equality of all before an all-loving God. It was a powerful antidote to the Neo-Confucian orthodoxy that so oppressed their daily lives. Kenji was born into this world of secret devotion and constant fear. From a young age, he was taught the importance of keeping the family's true beliefs hidden from outsiders. He learned to recite the Heart Sutra by rote, even as he fervently whispered the Lord's Prayer when no one was listening. As Kenji grew into manhood, he shouldered ever greater responsibility in his tiny community. He led prayer meetings in hushed seaside caves and officiated weddings with crudely fashioned crosses. To the outside world, he played the part of the earthy fisherman with a ready laugh and a bounty of coarse stories. But Kenji was forever on guard, knowing that a single slip could bring the authorities crashing down on him and all he held dear. He lived with the ever-present dread of discovery, of failing in his sacred duty to carry the flame of his ancestors' faith. That dreaded day came in, the autumn of his 27th year, when a suspicious tax collector from the regional capital came investigating the village. Repulsed by the poverty and the crude dialect of the locals, the official was eager to find fault and squeeze more wealth from the downtrodden peasants. As the tax collector surveyed the village headman's ramshackle home, he spied something peculiar on the dirt-streaked wall. It was a rough outline of a cross etched in charcoal and half hidden behind tattered scrolls of Buddhist mantras. With a shout of triumph, the official seized upon this damning evidence of the forbidden's faith. When the headman fell to his knees, babbling desperate denials, the cruel bureaucrat only sneered, Certain he had unearthed the nest of dangerous heretics, Kenji watched in dread from the shadows as the tax collector summoned a squad of armed samurai to round up the terrified villagers. He knew he should run, flee into the mountains, and live to fight another day. But he could not abandon his flock to face the coming storm alone. With a heavy heart, Kenji stepped forward into the torchlight. In a calm, clear voice, he declared himself a follower of Christ and a leader of the hidden church. He commanded the trembling Edmund to stay silent to protect the others with his quiet compliance. Over the shouts of the samurai, Kenji began to sing a hymn of joyful surrender. As the warriors fell upon him with their clubs, Kenji rejoiced in the knowledge that his sacrifice would buy precious time for his fellow believers to scatter and regroup. He would gladly bear the coming torments, content in the promise of a glorious reward in the world to come. The untouchable class, one of the most striking examples of this. Entrenched inequality was the plight of the Borakumen, Japan's untouchable underclass. These were people born into hereditary occupations considered unclean by Buddhist and Shinto tradition, mostly work involving death or the handling of animal flesh like undertaking, butchery, tanning hides, and leatherwork. Imagine being born into this reviled caste through no choice of your own. Your family trapped for generations in a self-perpetuating cycle of discrimination and squalor. You're forced to live in a segregated hamlet on the outskirts of town, a crowded slum of ramshackle huts lacking even the meanest comforts. Forbidden from marrying outside your class, your spouse must come from the same wretched background, ensuring your children are born into the identical fate. Grinding poverty is all but guaranteed when the only occupations open to you are dirty, dangerous, and low-paid. You labor at grim, foul-smelling work from sunup to sundown and collapse exhausted each night in your bare hovel. When venturing into town on errands, you must wear distinguishing clothing that marks you as untouchable. A straw hat or a dirty, ragged kimono dot in the streets. People recoil from you or yell vicious insults. Shopkeepers charge you inflated prices or refuse to serve your kind at all. Dehumanizing discrimination follows you at every turn. Your children, too, face constant ostracism and bullying. Other families forbid their sons and daughters from associating with yours. No matter how bright and capable they may be, your offspring are barred from all but the lowliest occupations. The leather worker. This is the excruciating reality. Daiichi was born into an Borakumen ghetto on the edge of Kyoto in the late 1700s. As a young boy, Daiichi chafed at the demeaning restrictions and tried to venture out into the wider city. But when the other children noticed his telltale straw sandals and filthy rags, they taunted him mercilessly, pelting him with pebbles until he fled back to the muddy alleys of the outcast's slum. Daiichi's father, like his father before him, made a meager living as a leather worker. He took cowhides from local slaughterhouses and tanned them for months in great stinking vats of caustic vegetable tannins before working the rough leather into sandals, saddles, and scabbards. It was filthy, noxious work, but the only trade open to an untouchable man. From the age of 7, Daiichi was put to work in his father's fetid tanning yard. The astringent stench of cow urine and caustic lime permanently saturated his skin and hair. His hands became pocked with putrid sores from the hides soaked in their toxic baths. At the end of a long day up to his shins in the tanning pits, he would come home reeking, his lungs seared from the fumes. As he entered manhood, he dreamed of marrying a pretty girl from town, escaping his miserable lot in life. In the spring, he began slipping into Kyoto on market days, hoping to catch the eye of some lovely maiden. But he quickly learned even a friendly smile in his direction was out of the question. The city girls turned up their noses at his stench and scurried away in revulsion, sometimes spitting in his direction to ward off his pollution. Despairing, Daiichi finally wed the daughter of the local gravedigger in a perfunctory ceremony, resigning himself to perpetuating another generation of ostracized outcasts. Together, they raised 3 children in the same hovel he had grown up in, barely managing to keep them fed by their combined toil at society's foulest tasks. Though a proud man, Daiichi was forced to hide his face behind a woven reed hat in town, lest he provoke a torrent of abuse. Once when he dared look a samurai in the eye, the warrior smashed him in the face with an iron-studded club, knocking out his front teeth. Daiichi had no legal recourse, as the feudal authorities cared little how society's dregs were bullied and mistreated. The peasant's life, of course. Life was scarcely less constricted for the peasantry at large. Though spared the extreme stigma of the Burakumin, farm folk, too, found themselves locked into a bleak station fixed at birth. Serfs bound to the land of their local lord. They enjoyed precious few freedoms beyond the grueling labor that filled their waking hours. Imagine an existence of ceaseless, back-breaking toil from your earliest childhood days onward. You wake each morning on a reed mat, your belly half empty, and stumble out into the muddy fields to guide an ox-drawn plow or plant endless rows of rice seedlings bent double at the waist. Icy water soaks your legs to the bone as you slosh through the paddies, your feet cut in a braided dot at the height of the growing season. You're in the fields for 12, 14, 16 hours a day, pausing only for a few meager meals of millet gruel and pickled radish if you're lucky. Your face and neck are burnt nut brown by the unrelenting sun, your hands gnarled and calloused from gripping tools. A straw hat provides scant relief from the heat as you sweat and strain until every muscle aches. Of course, this assumes the weather is favorable and the harvest plentiful. Let the rains fail or winds lay the crops low, and your family teeters on the precipice of starvation. When the rice runs out, you forage for roots and bark, begging for table scraps on the outskirts of town. Sometimes you watch helpless as your aged parents or younger siblings waste away, bellies distended, too weak to rise from their pallets. A farmer's story. Such was the lot of Tetsuo, born into a poor farming village in the shadow of his lord's towering castle near Himeji in the early 1600s. From the age of 5, Tetsuo was in the rice fields beside his father, doing what he could to contribute to his family's survival. His childhood was an endless blur of blistered hands, aching muscles and growling hunger. At 13, Tetsuo watched helpless as his mother wasted away with fever after a meager harvest, her once strong body reduced to little more than a skeleton wrapped in paper-thin skin. He helped dig her grave in the rocky soil behind their hut, weeping as his father intoned a simple prayer to Amida Buddha for her salvation in the Western paradise. With his mother gone, Tetsuo took on even more work, rising before dawn to pound millet for gruel, then standing in the frigid paddies until dusk. His youth was a relentless cycle of planting, weeding, frightening away birds, and finally harvesting the precious rice on which the village depended utterly for survival. In a good year, that would be enough to fill their bellies until spring, after the tax grain was rendered up. In a bad one, they would huddle in their huts as the snow fell, subsisting on a thin gruel of boiled bark and bran, praying they would not follow their weakest members to the grave before the planting season renewed them. As a young man, Tetsuo did as was expected of him and married a plain farmer's daughter from the next village, taking her into his family's hut to bear the next generation of downtrodden tillers bound to their lord's land. She labored stoically beside him in the fields and rice paddies, even when heavy with child, pausing only to squat in the mud and deliver the next infant. Over the years, Tetsuo watched 4 of his children succumb to the usual ailments of the peasantry. 2 were carried off by dysentery, 1 by the pox, and another by a wasting cough that left him shaking and drenched in sweat as he gasped out his final rattling breaths. Such losses were expected among the farm folk, endured as they were to the precariousness of life. Tetsuo counted himself fortunate that 2 of his sons and a daughter survived to adulthood, knowing they would take their place beside him in the never-ending labor of their allotted plot. They would marry, bear children of their own, and one day open a spot in the earth for his weary bones. The cycle of toil, hardship, and acceptance would continue unbroken as it had for generations beyond. Memory doubt the rebel, but every so often a bolder soul would arise, questioning his ordained place and galvanized to action. One such man was Noboru, a peasant from a hard-scrabble village in the mountains of Honshu. Like his fellow farmers, Noboru had known backbreaking labor, gnawing hunger, and arbitrary exploitation at the hands of the samurai class since boyhood. But deep in his breast smoldered the embers of righteous anger at the injustice of his state. When a cruel new lord assumed control of his domain in the 1860s, Noboru found he could bear no more. The lord, eager to squeeze every last coin of productivity from his land, raised taxes to a crippling degree and ordered his samurai to beat farmers who fell behind in their quotas. That year, when an early frost decimated the harvest, he turned a blind eye as his people wasted and starved, unwilling to dip into his ample stores of reserve rice. Simmering with barely suppressed rage, Noboru began meeting with like-minded men from surrounding villages. In the dead of night, they gathered in the woods to vent their anger and contemplate rebellion. At first, such talk terrified Noboru, knowing the ruthlessness with which peasant uprisings were put down. But as he watched his fellows grow ever more gaunt and hollow-cheeked, his own young daughter wilting away, his fury overcame his fear. That spring, Noboru and his band made their move. In a meticulously coordinated strike, they set upon the Lord's tax collectors as they made their rounds, beating them and seizing their ill-gotten gains. They raided government storehouses, distributing rice and tools to the jubilant local farmers. Giddy with success, Noboru led his swelling mob toward the Lord's castle, torches in hand. But he had gravely underestimated the speed and harsh response of the ruling class. Informed of the uprising, the Lord dispatched his most ruthless samurai on horseback. Armed to the teeth, they rode down upon the rebel mob, trampling men beneath the hooves of their steeds, cutting down others in a whirlwind of flashing swords. The farmers scattered in terror, their farming tools no match for the samurai's blades. In the chaos, Noboru caught sight of the samurai commander, a sneering man astride a black charger. Half mad with righteous fury, Noboru lunged at him, swinging his crude spear with all his might. But the samurai contemptuously knocked it away with his sword, then cleaved Noboru's skull in two with an effortless riposte. Noboru crumpled to the ground, drowning in a crimson torrent, the light fading from his eyes as swiftly as his dreams of a more just world. In the aftermath, the Lord made a terrible example of the rebel farmers. Dozens were beheaded, their leaders cruelly crucified. The village was burnt to the ground, its women and children left to starve in the ashes, the coming changes. But unbeknownst to the callous ruling elite, the seeds of its eventual destruction had already been sown. The injustices and contradictions of the feudal system were becoming impossible to ignore, even as foreign powers were knocking at Japan's long-sealed doors. The time of the samurai was drawing to a close, the fury of the downtrodden peasantry no longer so easily contained. The Japanese people would endure yet more chaos, bloodshed, and upheaval before emerging into the light of the modern era. But emerge they would, shaking off the stagnation of centuries, embracing the revolutionary ideals of progress, openness, and equality. In a few heady decades, the shoguns, lords, and samurai would fade into legend, swept away by the tide of history. But the long nightmarish centuries in which they had held sway would not soon be forgotten. The specter of those dark times lingered, a cautionary reminder of a feudal past defined by cruelty, oppression, and entrenched inequality, a time